you used to do meetups about knowledge or data or information, and I would like to understand how to distinguish what is knowledge in comparison to data and in comparison to information.
Yeah, there's lots of different definitions, and I think if we start with knowledge, there's really a classical definition that goes something like, we can only say that someone knows something if that something is true, that someone believes it, and they're justifying in believing that. That's sort of your classical definition.
So that's knowledge.
That's knowledge.
Okay.
And then if people talk about, information, there's no single definition. Information is used in a sense of, knowledge, you becoming knowledgeable. That's sort of one sense of information. In another sense, information is, the bits and bytes and the pages in the book and something physical or digital, right? And data, something slightly different, sort of yet again. And there are several definitions, and probably worth even saying where the word data is coming from Latin for givens, right? So something's given to you in an experiment or in a mathematical sort of equation or a mathematical problem. And I think a lot of people think about the data and information and knowledge as some kind of hierarchy, right? I don't think it's actually useful. I think for practical reasons, data
you mean
and information is
not
really the
useful? You mean not useful to distinguish data
It's,
and information?
That's right. It's not useful to distinguish in the day-to-day work. I mean,
okay, so now we're speaking about the context. Okay, so what you're saying basically is depending on the context, it may make sense to distinguish or may not.
I think so. So if we think about data, I mean, all it is just a representation of something, real or imaginary. So it's a set of signs that we've recorded. Once we've recorded it, we can manage it.
All right. I know you worked in financial organizations and banks, and you were responsible, if I'm not mistaken, for quality, right? Of data or information for some kind of reports. So in this context, can we say that before there's some kind of validation or quality check or some kind of processing, where in the input you have, let's call it given, right, data, which with unknown quality, maybe bad quality, and in the output of this processing you have high quality or checked quality, right? So you can call the output knowledge or information.
Well, to me, it's all ultimately data. It's just data of different quality. To me,
okay, data of different quality. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it just doesn't make sense to distinguish it. If we think about all these different dimensions of quality, some regulators mention about 6 different dimensions as sort of core dimensions. If you look into some research, there's probably about 60 that people can count and describe. But what are they, right? So you have your completeness, your accuracy, your consistency, your timeliness, right? So there's all these dimensions. So you might start with data that has, for example, limited consistency, right? And you apply some sort of process and you end up with data with better consistency, but it's all still data. I mean, it's all data. It's about something. It's in some sort of containers. So try and introduce the sort of concepts of information and knowledge as something that you process data into. It really is not helpful in the day-to-day operation. Like it's all just data.
This is very interesting perspective to me because I'm not in the context of banks and reports, but just speaking about life. Uh, Usually, people confuse things like they can take some imaginary statement which is just made up and treat it as a true and useful knowledge, right? Like a fact, and base a lot of things on it. The life decisions, maybe business decisions, maybe governmental decisions even, right? So this is very interesting concept, is looking at anything is just data of different parameters, right? In your concept, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me, there is no such a thing as distinguishing information, knowledge, data, but a fake or completely made up statement, which is just not true, for example, or is useless or even harmful if we believe in it, right? You will call, rather than not knowledge or fake or a lie, for example, you will call a data of, for example, zero accuracy and, for example, zero usefulness or negative usefulness, because this is harmful, for example. So you will assign those parameters, right? And still call it data, even if it's not true, even if it's just harmful.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
it's really useful to think data as just the symbols. It's just a representation of something. It can be, accurate, inaccurate, imaginary, real. But it's just these signs. It's the representation. But
yeah,
I think I guess what I'm saying though is that there is difference ultimately between, data and knowledge. Knowledge is in our heads, right? Although there is ultimately the entire field of knowledge management, right? And in that field, people talk about all sorts of knowledge. There's a bit of a dichotomy between sort of the tacit and explicit, the collective and the personal. And so in that sort of knowledge management discipline, people would call, documents and data as a kind of knowledge, as a kind of explicit knowledge, probably collective because it's shared, right? That's what I mean when I'm saying there is no one single perspective, because a lot of disciplines developed sort of in parallel in silos, if you want, right?
I think this is a useful concept from psychological perspective. So decision making, for example, has different aspects, right? A mathematical aspect if you apply any calculational methods, right? It has psychological aspects, it has business aspects and philosophical as well. I think in first place philosophical, because we're talking about freedom field versus determinism. Here, from psychological point of view, the benefit of this approach, just call everything data, but with some parameters we can try to measure, like is it, to what extent is it true? To what extent is it, for example, checked, validated? To what extent is it useful in our context, and such and such? It might be other parameters. You named at least 5 or 6, I believe. I think you can even name more. All right, parameters for data quality. I think this is useful for us as humans because we eliminate the emotional association. Because if you say this is a fake, this is a lie, or this is truth, or this is super useful, or this is super harmful, we assign this emotional meaning to it, which make us maybe more biased, right? So our cognitive filters, they just switch on with those emotional assignment. But if we say, okay, what is the accuracy of this? What is the validity of this, right? What is the usefulness in our context of this? Then we eliminate absolute scaling. We eliminate this emotional attachment, and we just compare in relative scale.
Right.
And I think this is a key to reducing anxiety whilst decision making. Relative scaling rather than absolute scaling. You mentioned that knowledge is usefully about something, as I understood, which can be loaded to human's head. So, am I right that you will rather speak about knowledge, something only human related? And if we talk only about machine related information or data, this we perhaps would not call knowledge.
That's how I see it. And again, my perspective is data management, data governance, data quality within an enterprise. I find the distinctions between data and information not that useful from obviously management perspective. Really, everything that we're talking about is just different perspectives in different disciplines. Because if somebody came from the background of knowledge management, they would treat a lot of things that I call information and data, they would actually treat them as knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's just a different discipline. And I think
different discipline, yeah.
And I think it's interesting to see what the connections might be between the discipline of knowledge management and perhaps discipline of data management and data quality and data governance.
Yeah. I am familiar with approach where unstructured information, not very humanly understandable, or a little bit maybe messy, right? Will be called data. Still useful, but requires further processing. And structured data, well labeled, well categorized, well tagged, maybe with eliminated clutter, maybe with well-built dependencies, hierarchy, and such. Like what is a subset of what belongs to what. And so this processed and structured data will be called knowledge. So I'm familiar with this approach, but maybe it's not so generic as I understand now, right? Depending on the discipline.
It depends on, I think, on the discipline, and it depends on the angle from which you're approaching it.